This movie sucked. No, that's not what we're reviewing for today. Though, just in case anyone asks. Yes, I thought Kamen Rider Taisen from 2014 was just a bad movie with characters doing things just for the sake of the plot, leading to a ton of mischaracterization. Allegedly, it was so bad that Kamen Rider Ichigo actor Hiroshi Fujioka exercised his creative control and demanded that Toei produce a better send-off to his character, with him even providing his own input to the script. This did result in a much better film a couple years later, with a little ego stroking. Though really, if this man demands anything, then you give it to him if you know what's good for you. Anyway, yeah, this is a Doujinshi, a fan-made manga that specifically parodies that film. It was produced by the Doji Circle Shin Nankai Dai Kaisen and was originally released on September 2nd, 2018 at the 19th Rainbow-flavored Doujinshi event, basically a place where they sold exclusively Precure Doujinshi. Apparently, the Circle made a name for themselves by specializing in unique little crossovers with tokusatsu shows. If I could, I would love to check out some of their other books, but for now, this is their only book I own. And just in case anyone asks, I bought this book off of a site called Otaku Republic, hashtag not sponsored, and as of the time of this recording, unfortunately, it seems like it's been sold out and is out of circulation. Though I do recommend checking out some of their other wares if you're at all interested in Doujinshi. With that, let's take a look at the Heisei Precure versus the Showa Riders Anthology Taisen and see who will win in the end, and hopefully not in the most contrived ways possible. Seriously, both of the endings in this film sucked. Since this is an anthology, there are of course several different stories written by multiple authors. Though for our purposes today, we'll just focus on the opening and closing chapters that were written by this book's main author, TJ Type 1, that together create a complete story. Not to say that I think these other stories are bad, but for our purposes, I think it's best if we just stick with what most people bought this book for and really highlights how well at least 2/3 of the Toy Trinity can work together. Yeah, unlike what this is based off of, there isn't going to be some random run-in by any of the Super Sentai, which honestly is probably for the best. Anyway, our story opened with Blossom being threatened by Kamen Rider J, the one Showa rider with the ability to become an Ultraman and turn into a giant. Fortunately, she countered this with the Heartcatch Orchestra. Doesn't Tsubomi need the rest of her team in order to pull that off? You know what? I retract my complaint. The awesomeness of that team completely invalidates it. And she wasn't the only one taking on a Showa Rider, as Heart and Dream dealt with V3 and Rider Man. Kamen Rider number 2 was fighting Bloom in a battle of the second incarnations, I guess. The Go-Go version of Dream was fighting X, and yes, there's more than one Nozomi in this battle. Time displaced copies are just kind of a thing in these crossovers, as we'll again see in the next couple of pages. But before that, we also had Beat fighting Amazon in the Battle of the Wild Ones. Stronger fighting Flora while trampling over some flowers. Well, okay, at least this won't end because of those things. Happy was fighting Sky Rider, Peach was fighting Super 1 in the Battle of the Martial Arts Experts, Zekross restoring some Shuriken and Miracle, and Whip was fighting, oh god, Shin? Okay, I'll admit, I'm not the biggest Ichika fan ever, but are we really gonna have one of the most non-violent pinks ever fight one of the riders who is definitely not made for kids? Okay, so a little history. Shin Kamen Rider Prologue was a film made to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the franchise. Realizing that most veteran fans would also at least be in their 20s by that time, Toei figured that they could make a more violent and realistic take on the guys who turned into Grasshopper Superman. And by that, I mean having a henshin that was reminiscent of the 1986 version of The Fly and giving the rider Sub-Zero's fatality. Allegedly, it was also the original creator Shotaro Ishinomori's favorite rider project, and in fact reflected his original vision for the superhero. If you're at all interested, the full movie is available legally here on YouTube on Toei's official Tokusatsu channel. And honestly, it's not that bad of a film on its own, but it's definitely not the Kamen Rider that most of us are used to. Thus, I can totally understand why this film bombed and didn't receive its intended sequel. And yeah, Ichika trying to fight this guy would be like sending an actual rabbit in. There was also Lovely vs. Zeto, two characters from productions that tried to celebrate anniversaries, but really only the former technically did. And last and most appropriately, the two incarnations of Cure Black fighting Kamen Rider Black and Black RX. Personally, I think Max Heart Nagisa should be fighting RX, but I don't know, maybe TJ felt the designs matched up better. All of this was being witnessed by Hana, who couldn't understand why everyone was at each other's throats. And of course, a certain passing by rider had the answers. For anyone unfamiliar, this is Kamen Rider Decade Tsukasa Kadia, a Heisei rider with the ability to turn into any of his brethren. As a result, he's considered to be one of the strongest riders, to the point that some consider him to be the destroyer of worlds, and by some, I mean mostly this guy, Narataki. And if you expect me to explain this dude's deal, keep waiting. Nobody, including Toei themselves, really understands what his motivations are, and quite frankly, nobody really cares at this point. Though I do think Tsukasa's explanation here is adequate. Main thing was that he was here to provide exposition that Tsukasa and Hana couldn't totally grasp at first because again, it's Narataki. He did at least spell it out by explaining how the world of the Showa riders and the Heisei Precure were colliding, much like in Decade series, and the only way to save the worlds was to destroy the other. Understandably, all this Crisis on Infinite Earths nonsense was starting to really annoy Hana. You and every DC reader ever. But before she could get more answers, Kamen Rider Ichigo Takeshi Hongo arrived, and while I do consider Han to be one of the better pink leads we've gotten in recent years, I do really kind of wish we had gotten this savage in the actual show. Anyway, Hongo of course repeated his lines from Kamen Rider Taisen that didn't apply to Hana at all, but the old dude wasn't listening. Don't mind him too much, Hana. I think all of that oxygen deprivation from all of those trips to space are finally starting to get to him. Regardless, Hana had no choice but to take on the Grizzly Vet, giving us this awesome 2-page spread. Seriously, Pom-Poms versus a Rider Kick should not be this epic, but somehow TJ managed to make it work, ending the first half of this story on quite the high note. Part 2 opened with both the Riders and the Precure being blown away by explosions. I hope if they ever adapt this, they get Koichi Sakamoto as the action director. And the one behind the attack was this Titan that Stronger identified as the final boss of his series, the Rock Great Leader, and yes, that name and design were real things. Show was a different time. Still, what made the character a little more interesting was the fact that he was also the great leader of almost all of the villain factions the Showa Riders fought against, going all the way back to the OG with Shocker. This was pointed out to the writers through his voice, as behind the scenes, they did all use the same VA, Goro Naya, to keep things consistent in spite of the many different designs. They also said he was the leader of X and Amazon's villain factions, even though he didn't play such a role in either show, though he was the narrator of Amazon, which this manga lampshaded. Though sadly, Naya passed away in 2013, and his roles were inherited by Tomokazu Seki, which in this manga's recreation of that scene, Nagisa additionally pointed out they sounded like her partner. Actually, maybe that's why we haven't heard Meppo talk in any of the recent crossovers. He's finally decided to embrace his villainous side. Anyway, the Great Leader, as we'll call him, of course revealed that he had been behind the worlds colliding, and he had been waiting in the shadows until the Riders and Precure had exhausted each other with their fights, to the point that he could easily pick off the scraps and finish them all off at once. His goal was to destroy both of their worlds, and in turn erase the very existence of the Showa and Heisei eras. In their place, he would rule over a new timeline, an era that he would call the Seki Tomo era. Yeah, okay, that might sound even more ridiculous than a guy wanting to reset the day just to save an old school building, but then he said he would make it so that everyone would have his voice. So wait, you're telling me I could sound like Domon Kashu and quote as much G Gundam as I could ever want? Precure, Riders, y'all can just take this L just this once, it's no big deal really. With that, the Great Leader delivered one final blow, seemingly ending the fight. Narutaki of course went off on his usual spiel of blaming everything on Decado, even though the leader just said it was all his doing. Said living quarry was reading what had to be a pretty huge newspaper in order to fit into his fingers and be legible. But he was able to read it, and it said it was still the Heisei era, at least when this Doujinshi originally came out. Sure enough, all of the riders and cures were still around, much to the Great Leader's confusion. As it turned out, they did the one thing that many of the actual Taisen films failed to do, or at least properly portray, and had the characters act like actual heroes who could cooperate to take down a greater evil. This confused the GL, as he believed that the Precure and Kamen Rider never had any sort of connections that they could work off of. Well, clearly someone didn't watch my video. And yes, this is a shameless plug. Sure enough, the Nagisas and Kotaros pointed out their actors' connections, or rather the narrator did, and I love how this manga even pointed out how this had to be read by Shinji Nakai, the late narrator of most of the Showa Rider shows. This book was clearly written with a lot of passion towards both of these franchises, and I'm just having a blast reading it. With that, we got two more great two-page spreads. The first featuring a top panel where all of the riders and cures attacked the Great Leader at once, with even Ichika possibly getting in a super effective hit against the rock type depending on how much water content was in that cream. From there, the lower half of the pages featured Hongo and Hana verbally taking down the leader by punching and kicking a bunch of holes into his motives, basically pointing out how Showa and Heisei were created from the efforts and experiences of many people working towards their own goals, and not just by some weirdo who wanted everyone to sound like Daru from Steins Gate. It's admittedly some really cheesy dialogue, but still strong words that reflected the established moralities of both characters. From there, we got the best 2 pages of this whole book, as the show writers came together to form the Rider Syndrome to transfer their powers to Hana, who delivered a massive heart for you to finish off the Great Leader. Again, Pom Pom should not come off as this badass, and yet this book manages to pull it off. However, the GL still had some dying breaths to get in, and realizing that his malice wasn't subsiding, Hana realized that she started to feel bad for the big guy as he just couldn't give up on his insane dream. However, some familiar looking words appeared in the lower left side of the page, and Kireko just arrived. Yeah, out of nowhere, Ayumi was here and she managed to fully purify the Great Leader. Even Tsukasa commented on this with some very meta dialogue referencing All-Star's memory of all things, and it wouldn't be his last bit of fourth wall breaking as he spoke with Narutaki about the contents of the book they were in. I swear, if this turns out not to be Tsukasa, but rather Deadpool having stolen his driver, then I'm leaving. Well, okay, I actually really like this meta commentary, at least more than what we got from that film, as Tsukasa discussed the endless possibilities that Doujinshi anthologies like this book can produce. From combinations like Kamen Rider and Precure to even Aikatsu and Prepara. Personally, I'm a little more interested in a crossover with Idolmaster. Kuroto makes an appearance in that, that's all I need to say. In the case of this book, Tsukasa claimed that he had brought together multiple stories based around Kamen Rider Taisen in order to track down Ayumi and bring her into this story. Yeah, obviously this was TJ and Shin Nankai Daikessen speaking through Tsukasa, but at the same time, this doesn't exactly go against the meta-breaking writer's MO. Especially after he revealed that those earlier familiar-looking words I mentioned, yeah, as it turned out, that was an attack ride card he had created based off of a phrase that the narrator of Kamen Rider Black RX would often say right before a big Deus Ex Machina moment in that show, like when RX got his OP form changes. Yeah, he created a card specifically so that they could have their big climactic moment for this story. Would you believe this is just another Tuesday for the Destroyer of Worlds? Trolly Decado aside, this final speech from him was pretty amazing. As after Narutaki asked why he did all of this, Tsukasa began to talk about how finite our memories of the past are, and that if we're not careful, parts of our history can be lost to the sands of time, which of course includes our entertainment like Kamen Rider and Precure. Be it through stuff like photos, fan-made works, or even digitally. Yeah. The pandemic took a significant chunk out of the revenue of all of the toy productions, which weren't exactly having great years previously. And while I do want to be optimistic since I enjoy all of these shows, the realist in me has to admit that these are very niche franchises that could easily be cancelled sooner rather than later. Kamen Rider has gone through it more than once, and Precure has teetered on it. It really is just an inevitability, but there will always be ways of maintaining those memories. Considering this was all coming from a guy who tried to preserve the existence of all of the Rider worlds, be they the originals or even alternate reality worlds, I have little doubt that Tsukasa would be able to preserve the worlds of the Precure as well. With that, this Doujinshi ended with a nice group shot of our heroes and heroines celebrating their well-earned victory. I really like this Doujinshi. It has some fantastic art, fun character interactions, and as short as it is, it manages to get its message of protecting the past and the present a lot better than the stuff it references. The main thing I like about fanworks like this is just how much passion and love they often show towards the source material. I mean, it goes without saying, the art in this book was just amazing. Every character looked good in spite of their many varying designs and art styles between the Cures and the Riders. Just getting Ichika and Shin in the same panel is a hell of an accomplishment in of itself. And of course, the fights were all appropriately epic, with all the 2-page spreads getting across a ton of detail and strong sense of impact. If they ever actually do a Rider and Precure team up, it better look something like this at the very least. They also included little details like pointing out the voice actors, which is something I can appreciate, as well as made a ton of references to some major points in the history of both franchises. The final fight with the Rock Great Leader is often considered to be one of the most important moments in Rider history, as it almost became the end of the franchise after they had lost their TV time slot due to declining ratings. Thus, using Kim as the final boss who wanted to end both franchises felt almost too appropriate. And sure, while his motivations were purposely silly, they also fit well with the major theme of this story. Our histories are precious and should be preserved. This is especially true for Japan now that they've entered into the Reiwa era. And yet, between all of the remakes and so-called reimaginings, our pop culture and entertainment of the past is being treated like an expendable commodity that could just be dismantled and replaced with the new, better histories. I think this sort of mistreatment of the past was one of the biggest criticisms lodged against the Taisen films, hence why Hiroshi Fujioka tried to correct it. Meanwhile, this book managed to give its own perspective on the matter. As while the series of the past shouldn't be forgotten, the future of these franchises should also be embraced and allowed to create their own histories, preferably without trampling on others. And when the inevitable day comes when all of this comes to an end, at the very least, many of us will keep these memories alive. As I said, this Doujinshi is unfortunately out of circulation since it is a fan work, but if you can find it for a reasonable price, do pick it up and help preserve the little history that these dedicated fans managed to carve out for themselves. Next up on the agenda though is that series about that Cure who might have had a few words with Stronger about those flowers he ran over. I'll try to shoot for a February release for the first part of my Gold Princess review. Sorry that it's taking a little long. I'll just say 2021 so far has been kind of busy for me. Still look forward to it. And until then though, for now my friends, and yeah, you know, I've been meaning to develop a new look, so I wonder, can this thing provide me with something?